So welcome to our last National ACT meetup of 2022. It's been a fast and furious year. Just a quick look at our agenda for today. We'll do some brief intros and announcements. Just a quick reminder in those announcements that we've got the new ACT e-primer, which is a 2-hour online course. It's for free, and I'll put that link into the chat. It's not meant to take the place of in-person startup training, skills-based training, but it is an opportunity for anyone to participate, to learn more about ACT, especially as they're getting onboarded to a new program, but also for any administrators that want to know more about ACT, or supervisors, or even policymakers. Today, we're excited to have our very own Lorna Moser talking to us about what your ACT Daily Team meeting may reveal about overall practice. And then we will save some time for open mic, as we usually do, where we want to hear from you and your questions or anything you want to kind of say and share with the group. We encourage you at that time to raise your hand, and it's often nice to kind of see people's faces, even though your video is off up until that point, but to hear your voices and to see your face as you ask those questions. And then just a quick note that because this is our last one of the year, our next one won't be until Monday, February 6th. So remember, we're every other month, same time, same place, and my colleague here at University of Washington, Sarah Kapelovich, will be joining to present on Psychosis Reach, which is a CBT-informed care approach for families and caregivers, which is a great opportunity for you all to get trained up in that, and also to encourage families to also participate and in that national resource. Quick housekeeping: most of you have been on with us before, it looks like, from what I can tell from the names, but just, again, to note, you're all muted and your cameras are automatically off. We'll, again, when we get to the Q&A, being able to kind of ask those questions, we'll hopefully get to see a couple of you anyway during that time. The slides are on our website. I will also post that link here in a second. And these meetings are also recorded. So if you ever miss one of these, or you want to forward it to a colleague, you can send that on the link. Just a quick note. So for chat, just make sure if you've got questions that you want to have answered today, instead of putting that into the chat, you're going to put that into the Q&A box. The chat's really for folks to introduce themselves. So feel free to introduce yourself now if you haven't already, to say where you're from. It's always nice to see who's on these calls. Or just to make a comment, you can put that in there. Otherwise, please use the Q&A box to post your question, and that way we can kind of keep track of who's asking questions and if we've answered it either live or put the response into the answer box there. And again, you can just raise your hand if you want to pose your question in person rather than putting it into the Q&A box. So with that, our quick intros, I think many of you know Lorna and me, but just for those of you joining us for the first time, my name is Maria Monroe DeVita, and I'm at the University of Washington, where we oversee training and consultation of our ACT teams in Washington State, but also provide training nationally. I'm the co-author of the Team ACT Fidelity Tool for assertive community treatment, along with Lorna, and we're excited to have you all here today. I'll turn it over to Lorna.
Hey everyone. So pretty much everything Maria said, except I'm at UNC in Chapel Hill and have a team of about 11 consultants and trainers who work closely with me, providing support across North Carolina, but also to several other places across the nation as well. So very happy to be here.
And so I think we're going to do a quick shift out of slides, and you can share your screen, Lorna.
Yes.
Stop my share. Do yours. And I'll post all the stuff I said I was going to post in the chat, so you'll get a bunch of notifications here.
All right. So I'm going to trust you can see my screen.
Looks good.
All right. So it's funny, when you were reading the title of this, Maria, I was thinking, like, it reminds me of like some like Vogue magazine, like what your favorite ice cream flavor reveals about you.
Oh yeah. I love that.
tantalizing. So we'll do a little bit of a summary to get on the same page about ACT and the ACT Daily Team Meeting, and then I'll go into some of these examples. This is not all exhaustive, and welcome other observations that you all probably have for yourself too. So as you all know, ACT is this kind of all-encompassing service that is designed to be a platform that you're plugging in a bunch of different types of treatments and supports that's going to be relevant and useful for the intended population ACT serves, people with more serious mental illness looking to live and succeed in the community. So this includes treatment, medications, therapies, integrated substance use treatment, physical health interventions, different types of supports, which includes crisis supports, transportation, basic care coordination, case management, working with families, coordinating with other institutions like hospitals and jails. And also a key piece of this is outreach and engagement, where we're working to use skills like motivational interviewing skills, assertive engagement, and doing really good person-centered assessment and planning. And then also a big piece of ACT, because it is a longer-term service for a lot of folks, is that we're doing rehabilitation. So we're working with people to help identify the types of jobs that they want to do and helping them have success in those jobs, going back to school, success around living in their apartment. So there's a lot of skill building that's going on to help them really integrate within the community, wellness management, recovery, and supportive housing. So it's a lot that we're designed to do. I often will use the comparison that it's the equivalent of your Costco, BJ's, Sam's Club, where you can get a lot of needs met in one place. And because of how much we're trying to tackle within the team of ACT, there is a need to do a lot of care coordination. So this is what the essence of the daily team meeting is. It's the place in which you're doing intentional care coordination, which involves deliberately organizing individual care activities, sharing information among all the participants concerned with the care so that you're providing good, safe, effective services. So if you keep that in mind, that is the point of us coming together as often as we are doing. And there is a very cyclical process going on where the daily team meeting is a part of. So you all probably are familiar with the idea of doing what we call roll call. You're sharing information about individuals who were seen the previous 24 hours or weekend. So that sharing that data, you're sharing information during the daily team meeting. As that information gets shared, you're then confirming, revising the planned interventions for the next 24 hours or weekend. So it's going to lead to potential changes on what it is we're going to do, because we're designed to be anticipatory and responsive to things changing. And then we create and confirm the schedule, and then people go off and they deliver services and supports according to that schedule. As they're doing that, you're recollecting more information about how is the person doing? What was the response to the intervention? What are other notable things going on in this person's life and environment? Then you come back and you share that data again. And all of this, ideally, with the work and the schedules of services, is all grounded back into a really good person-centered plan that was developed, that we had some clarity around what does the person care about? What do they need from us? And who's doing what and when it comes to service delivery. We'll come back to that point probably several times. And when we're in the daily team meeting and we're sharing information with each other, the information is going to be part of that roll call, which I'm going to have a slide to speak a little bit more about what we're sharing during the roll call, but also can include just bigger updates, critical events that happen, such as the fact that we just learned that so-and-so is being discharged out of the hospital today, and not necessarily in 3 days when we thought it was. We are also sharing information that pertains to like a recent assessment or intake. So if the nurse just conducted a nursing assessment, they can come in and give a very brief overview of some of the highlights that they were capturing through that process. So everybody's staying apprised of new information we're bringing in. At times during roll call, a deeper dive needs to go into talking about somebody's circumstance. And so you may have a parked conversation so that you can have more of an intentional exploration of what's been going on, what's tried, and what are the next steps. And then also we're sharing at times observations around how somebody's stage of change readiness may have changed, and therefore we need to update what we're doing and re-strategize. So a lot of different information is being shared in this meeting. And when it comes to roll call, information shared during that when you're naming individuals served and then somebody's doing a report out, you're reporting out basic information that's relevant to changes in clinical status, presentation, symptoms, behaviors, especially things that really are deviating from maybe what's normal. That will come back to too, because for people who are new to the team, they don't know yet what's normal. So being somewhat comprehensive can be part of the teaching of everybody what's common presentation versus maybe not common presentation for a given individual. We also are sharing information about what did we do? What are some of the services, supports, and interventions that we offered? What was the response to those interventions? And highlight successes when we see successes. Any lingering issues or to-dos that we need to make sure get on the schedule in the near future. So really locking down the plan of what's going to happen next. And then often, not often, an expectation of teams is that we're maintaining something that's called a client log. So you're able to kind of keep a brief snippet of what happened in that encounter. You know, this is basically serving as a snapshot of care for somebody in a given period of time. So we typically recommend that it's organized around per person, per month, pre-dated out, so that you can not only see when services were provided, you're also capturing attempts, who delivered the service, whether it was face-to-face, phone, or some other means. And then also it's giving you information about the days they weren't seen. So it also serves to kind of have this kind of level of care snapshot to revisit when somebody seems to be getting not enough care, when maybe their engagement is dwindling towards the end of the month more than the beginning of the month. So it's information that kind of comes from this overall bird's eye view of what's happening. And then information is going into a scheduling process. And through ACT, they have multiple schedules that are crosswalking. On one hand, you should have what is basically the daily team schedule for that day. So Monday, we'll have some predictable things happening because we're delivering care with some purpose and consistency. But as we know, when you're sharing information through roll call, some things need to change because that person's coming out of the hospital and we need to make plans of how to support them as they're coming out today, which wasn't predictable. Also, along with that daily team schedule, it's being funneled in with information that's coming from the client schedule. So each client should have a schedule in which we have a plan, they're aware of it, of what is it we're doing when, who's coming, and what are we doing during that visit. That information is stemming back to that person-centered plan. And then you have staff schedules so that we have a sense that when Maria is going out to do her work on a Monday, we have an idea of how much is her schedule pretty packed and full with the allotment of times needed to do the services we're planning to do that day. And when does she have some free space so that if we're making a change or adding somebody in to work more closely with Maria, that we know that Thursdays will be the ideal day to fit that in. So it's kind of a resource management way of looking at where people's time is being spent. Finally, with the schedule, as I mentioned, a lot should be predictable, but you are going to be then fitting in those emerging needs, things that weren't necessarily planned for, but were being responsive and anticipatory. So we're going to add it into the schedule. And also we're protecting time for all the indirect stuff. We're being thoughtful about how much time is needed to travel, or you're protecting time for things like supervision, the daily team meeting even. And then also with getting those service notes done. And then with a well-developed schedule, it is going to be, it's going to be of better quality if we also had a very well-developed person-centered plan. So again, that is the ideal source for all of the information that's going into our scheduling process. And when we say a well-developed person-centered plan, we're being clear about what it is we're delivering to this individual. What do they need from us? What do they want from us? What are their goals? What's getting in the way and what's helping them right now? Along with specifying the what is it we're doing, we're specifying who is providing this. So who is part of the team that's best equipped to deliver this service to this specific individual, given their preferences? How often is it being provided? Sometimes we're clarifying for how long are we doing this? And then as best as you can, working with individuals around their preferences, around the when. What time of the day is ideal for them given this service? What days of the week or how often? And then another thing to be mindful of is always asking the why behind why are we doing this? So when we're delivering the service in a certain way, being clear about when so-and-so is being brought in on Wednesdays to attend the wellness management and recovery group, what is it we're hoping for this person to get out of this group? What skills or understanding is going to be an important takeaway to help them move closer to other goals that they have for themselves? So always asking the question of why are we doing this? And finally, in our overview, getting close to the overview, coming to an end, is really attending to, again, the use of a team approach that's using something like an individual treatment team. So that when Barb is getting services, we're attending to what does she care most about, what's important to her, and who's best equipped to meet those needs. So for Barb in this example, family's important, really wants to stay in this apartment she feels safe in. She's expressed that she believes she has some problems with drinking, so drinking too much alcohol. She has diabetes and is working on managing that. She has a really good bond with Diane, the peer. So in this case, Barb is mostly seen by Tony, the nurse, Diane, the peer, and James, a substance abuse specialist or co-occurring disorder specialist. The whole team knows Barb. Barb has met the whole team. But when it comes to more predictable care, she's meeting more often with James, Tony, and Diane. So the daily team meeting time. So for a team that's serving 100 people, oftentimes you can get through the process of the daily team meeting in about 60 minutes. So if you look at the bold font parameter there, that is the time set aside for the daily team meeting. So in this case, we're saying 8:30 in the morning to 9:30. Within that boundary, a big part of that time is going to be spent doing the roll call. But also you'll see that we're using that time to do some other things. One thing may be population health and outcome tracking. So you have a process in place in which you're listening for and tracking pieces of information like somebody coming out of the hospital, somebody getting a job, reports around somebody's weight has changed. So the nurse may be tracking some health information. There also is opportunity to build in some brief team building exercises. The daily team meeting is one of the few times that the team is coming together and has a chance to have some bonding and building team cohesion. So it's important to create space for that too. That may involve a little storytelling and chatting, and I'm going to come back to where that can go a little bit too far. But some of it is important for us to really feel like we're kind of colleagues working on this together. Another piece that sometimes gets left out, or not sometimes, often, is how much we need to build in an emphasis towards scheduling during the daily team meeting. When this is falling to the wayside, it can reflect some other things going on, which I'm going to show with some examples. Planning around individual crisis, doing some administrative housekeeping. Some things may go outside the daily team meeting time, like individuals who get parked for deeper discussion. So if during roll call, somebody shares something that is of concern and needs a lot more conversation, you may find that putting that individual's name to the side, returning back towards the end of the daily team meeting, it keeps the pace of everything moving, but you have the people who most need to be part of that conversation stay back to talk it through and come up with a clear plan of action. And then finally, using some of the time, which again may extend out, to do consultation and cross trainings. Act in this multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary team approach. We're always all teaching each other to elevate all of our competencies across all these different practices. So it's a lot. We use this time ideally to serve a lot of needs within the team. So we believe it's a really critical function of a well-run team. So I'm going to give some examples of things that we see sometimes and what may be behind it. So I'm going to lay out a few assumptions because we know for a lot of you right now, you're struggling around having sufficient staffing. And when you are really understaffed, you end up having to do basics to just get by. And we understand that can happen. So we want to just make some assumptions that this team is nearly fully staffed or staffed. They're nearly at capacity. So if they're a team designed to serve 100, this team may be serving 90 right now. And the intended clinical population is being served. So again, if a team starts serving a population that is really running askew from what the typical population is for ACT, which often is adults with more serious mental illness and a lot more challenges around day-to-day living and functioning, then you may see differences in how the meeting gets used. So these are just some basic assumptions. So here's challenge number one. We notice that there's minimal information being reported out altogether. So when somebody's name comes up, we're getting the basics like dropped off meds, doing okay, baseline. When we see this, one thing is that we may find out that really the level of care, that scope of work ends up being really narrow. And the team truly is being used a little bit more like a traditional case management, care management team. And so if what you're primarily believe that you're designed to do is provide med supports, basic housing supports, and getting access to food, you don't have much else to report out on. This also sometimes comes back to a lack of planning of services. So if the golden thread of doing good person-centered planning, which gets into schedules and directs our behavior, if that's breaking down, we just go out with a list of people we know we're going to go see, but we don't have a clear idea of what is it we're doing when we go and see them. Sometimes staff do more, but they're not trained to know what to report out on. So sometimes this is part of the problem, is that there's a lack of modeling and training on what's important to share during the daily team meeting. Another thing that can be going on is if somebody has too many people assigned to see in a given day, you don't have the luxury of time to do much else than the basics. So this comes back to when teams are understaffed, this can happen where you're just trying to cover. And so if your list has 10 people to go see today, 10 people typically means you're doing very brief check-ins and getting basic needs met in that moment. So there's not much else to report. Now, another thing sometimes we see is when teams get into too much, they use the time to do a whole lot of storytelling to the point that it feels almost gossipy. So I had my little clip here, and then her mom came by with this new man. You recall the last two guys she was with. So when that's happening, one thing that may be lacking is leadership directing the daily team meeting. So having somebody who has a presence of being a leader, who can really kind of direct the team to use this time more appropriately. Sometimes it can be that there's a recovery culture lacking within the team, because storytelling, again, can be important to some part with team cohesion and connecting as humans doing really important work, but it can go down a path that starts feeling pretty disrespectful to the people we're serving and the people in their lives. And so that's where storytelling that gets into feeling gossipy, where we're sharing information that really isn't that relevant, can be something that's creating a culture within the team that's not necessarily respectful of the people we're serving. Sometimes, again, it could come down to what's being delivered by the team isn't that high of a dose of care compared to what people probably likely need. And I think of it as this way: if you have the time to use this hour that turns into an hour and a half meeting because we're talking so much about things that aren't that relevant, if you have the luxury to eat up that much time in a day, it tells me that you aren't urgent. You don't have a sense of urgency to get out the door and start seeing people, because you know that there's a lot to do today, a lot of important stuff to be working on with folks. So one question for me is, when I see teams that do excessive storytelling, is that there is a lack of urgency to get your day moving so that these 8 staff can just start going. I always think of like a team meeting that ends up being 30 minutes longer than it should be for a staff of 8 people, just took 4 hours of care away from people for that day. And then sometimes you'll see teams that the storytelling and going on too long is a subgroup of folks, that there's cliques that are forming, almost like a little bit too much enmeshment, that again, it ends up taking over in terms of the personality of the team and when they're coming together. Another thing we see sometimes that can reveal something about the team is that when they're doing roll call, you're hearing a lot of attempts. So you're doing roll call, Camille, not home, Ricardo, seem less depressed, provide a weekly med pack, Peter, attempt, Foster, attempt. So when we hear this, my first question is, are we delivering planful interventions that's addressing what people care to have addressed? If you're delivering something that the person values and believes could be helpful to them, they are more likely to be present. Also, if you're showing up with some predictability and that you know, I'm using Maria. Maria's coming out again on Monday because this person knows Maria comes out every Monday. She comes out every Monday, and Maria takes me out for coffee because we're working on some socialization skills. And I like that. I value that. I'm more likely going to be around. Versus if Steve's coming out and Steve's always wanting to talk about whether I took my medications over the weekend, and he's not hearing me that I really don't like these medications and I don't really want to be taking them, I may not open the door to Steve. So being mindful about delivering the thing that they most want from you usually increases the successful visits. Sometimes teams interpret the idea of a team approach that everybody sees everybody. So they set up a rotation, and sometimes they'll use geography where you're rotating in these quadrants of the city. And from that perspective, there's no continuity of care. There's very little opportunity for me to develop trusting relationships with staff because I'm constantly seeing everybody and repeating things. And so that may result in me not being around as often. Not attending to preferences around when, where to be seen, or giving the respect of a specific time. When we're telling people like, I'll be around sometime between 1 and 5 o'clock, that's a 4-hour window we're asking them to just sit around waiting for us. Also being attentive again to stages of change readiness and delivering stage appropriate supports. So an example would be that when I'm showing up, I am trying to deliver something that's like an active treatment approach. But that person is a much earlier stage of change readiness. They don't necessarily see this as a problem that they need to change. And so when we're misaligning our approach to treatment, given their stage of change, we sometimes don't have as much success with actually seeing them anymore. Another misstep or things that we see that may reveal something is when the report out is not being disciplined to the previous 24 hours or weekend if it's a Monday. And you're hearing a lot of reporting out of things that happened weeks ago. When I hear that happening within the team, one of my first questions is, are they really meeting every day? What's the expectation around staff attendance? Because if I'm sharing a lot of old information, it makes me wonder, did you not meet the next day and share that information when it was more timely? Another thing that can happen is sometimes the team has a psychiatric care provider who's not showing up very often. They may not be with the team that often. And so there always is this tendency for the team to think they have to catch that provider up on what's been going on. And so we would discourage that. That's not a good use of time. There should be other communication mechanisms that keeps the psychiatric care provider apprised of what's been happening with the people served. We should not be using the time to rehash things that's already been shared. Relatedly, sometimes we see that the psychiatrist will just pop in for a portion of the meeting and then leave. And so when that happens, you know, it's something like, anything I need to know about these 3 people on my schedule today, give some quick updates, and then they're gone. When that happens, it's an indication that that psychiatric care provider is not very integrated within the team. Their role, ideally, with the team leader is they are co-clinical leaders. They are listening for the information being shared that should be of some level of concern or needing of a different response. And so when they're not present very often, the team's missing out on another clinical leader listening for things that need to have a different response or different level of attention. When we see this happening too, it's not uncommon. It's because they're not assigned to work with the team very much either. So there's not many hours in the way that we need, given the size of team. And then another thing is, if what is shared in the daily team meeting is really not that relevant and clinically useful, they and others start kind of like checking out. In this example, they're not really popping in, they're not staying for the whole thing, because what is being shared is this robotic, narrow baseline, doing okay, got groceries, and we're not sharing much else about what's going on with the individual. Another thing that we sometimes see is that in the daily team meeting, a concerning situation gets shared, and that's about it. There's the sharing and nothing else happens. So we call out roll call. Felicia, she was really anxious and hyperverbal this morning. She shared that she believes that somebody broke into her apartment over the weekend. Saw the lock on her door looked kind of screwed up, like somebody stuck a screwdriver in it. Team kind of nods, looks concerned. Then they call Bill. Baseline. So we're listening for this when we're observing daily team meetings. Like, if you're sharing things of concern, we need to seize a moment to kind of explore that and clarify next steps. And this is where the parking lot process becomes really important, so that we don't necessarily disturb the pace of things, but we grab onto something that just got shared and we bookmark it to come back to with intention. So when we see this happening, sometimes it can be a lack of clinical sophistication within the team. The clinical leadership presence is absent. So we don't have tuned ears hearing that, oh, that's a concern and we need to do something about this. Whether it's symptoms, something changes in their environment. Relatedly, is the team being really equipped and knowing how to apply what's called the risk need responsivity model. So where you're listening for potential increases of risks for somebody and really coming up with a plan of how to address those potentially pending risks. So again, in the daily team meeting, when we're looking at this from the perspective of an evaluator, we're listening for concerns being shared, and then that there's a plan put in place of how to address. Another thing we see sometimes from teams is there's a whole lot of multitasking going on. And so people's attention spans are like divided across 4 activities, one of which is usually getting service notes done. So sometimes why we see this happening is because the team isn't really using a team approach to begin with. I know who my folks are that I serve, and I know what I'm doing with them and what we're working towards. And it's not really a point of me to listen to the other 78 names called out because I'm minimally involved with them. So that sometimes happens. Sometimes, oftentimes, staff feel very overextended and they don't know when to get some of these things done. And this is like, well, this is an hour of my time. I can at least get these 8 service notes submitted. So that indirect time is not being protected in the way that it needs to be. Also, related to what I shared with the psychiatric care provider, sometimes if what's being shared is of little value, it's not very relevant, people start checking out and not really pay attention, which really doesn't serve the grander purpose of this meeting. So again, revisiting what needs to be shared and how to share it so that it maintains this level of engagement and interest. Another thing we sometimes see is that there's no discussion or review of the schedule. This, I will say, is actually kind of common. The whole meeting ends up being roll call, doing some updates. Nobody circles back to talk about the schedule. So again, when teams are not using a team approach where people are intentionally patched in to see people with a reason, then it's like, well, I got my own schedule. I got 12 people I see throughout the week for the most part, and I know what I'm doing and when I'm doing it with them. So I don't really need to go back to review a schedule. So they're making their own schedules and managing their own schedule, which is not what ACT should be. We should have a centralized team schedule that we're using to guide everything. Sometimes it's because there's inadequate oversight of emerging needs and flexing the schedule. So, there is a set kind of like, here's what Monday looks like. And there's no real process put into place where we're really listening for what needs to change. Who do we need to see more often, given what we know now? Who needs different types of supports, given what we know now? And there's an intentional change in what the team's going to do. So when that's lacking, you end up seeing little review of the schedule to begin with. And then finally, little tailoring of scheduling per individual serve. So it's similar to what I just said, but it's this finessing where when you see teams revisit the schedule in the daily team meeting, usually it's coming at the end because you need to do the roll call to see, given what we just shared, do we need to make changes to what we plan to do today? And part of that is kind of like you're at the end, you're going around to every person on the team, and the team leader or whoever's managing the schedule is literally going to be looking at Maria and saying, okay, Maria, so I have you going over to see Troy first because he's got the housing inspection tomorrow, and that may take some time. So I made sure that you have at least 90 minutes. But then we have that treatment team meeting for you to come back to for the office. And I'm going to make sure that Donna and her mom have a plan for getting here. And then at the end of the day, so you're kind of reviewing things. And part of that review too is not just rehashing like what's going to happen and what's new that got served up today. Part of it too is doing these kind of reminders, like being able to say, Felicia's been really anxious. So just as a reminder, she gets more anxious if you have too much eye contact. So make sure you're being mindful about your eye contact with her today. So you're giving little tips and reminders to everybody. The thing with doing this kind of review of the schedule too, it keeps us all accountable to doing ACT. If all we're doing is reminding each other to go drop off these meds and get some groceries and check in on how they're doing, that should be a reflection back to us to say, why aren't we talking about employment? Why isn't anybody addressing the fact that they seem to be getting a little bit mixed into using opioids, and we're going to be having a plan for how we're going to be trying to have conversations? Like, it calls back some realities of like, what are we doing as a team when you name the schedule and who's doing what? Similarly, when you see everyone is scheduled to be seen like once a week, that right there is a red flag for me in terms of overall level of care that we're planning to deliver. And so if we're doing person-centered care with the right population for ACT, we should see a huge variety in what people are getting from the team, because there are people with different needs, and we're one-stop treatment shop, or supposed to be. So person-centered planning is breaking down. There can be a very limited scope of practice. So the team sees themselves as the weekly med pack delivery, and maybe we'll throw in a trip to the store. Sometimes it indicates there's other providers that are involved when maybe they shouldn't be as involved. So in one situation, and maybe there's a whole lot of people living in residential settings instead of getting support of being out in the community in places that are more integrated. You could have some teams that are relying on, say, home health nurses going out and doing work that ideally really should be delivered through the team and not the home health. So sometimes that once a week is an indication that there's other people patching in, what we call brokering out, in a way that shouldn't be happening. And then finally, sometimes when there is a lower level of care being delivered, and just calling out again, we understand when staff shortages are happening, you are trying to get basics done. What it can be is that your service catchment area is almost too expansive. So you are serving people that the drive time, which is an indirect time, is taking way too much time away to doing direct care. And so you end up having a low level of care being offered to everybody. So it's another thing, and it's not even just the drive time considers, those of you who are working in very urban metropolitan areas where it's not you're really traveling that far, it just takes a long time to get there because of traffic. And I believe this is one of the last ones, is when you see a team where there's really no successes being shared in the daily team meeting. We're not speaking positively about things going on in people's lives. And so when I see that, one question is about just the culture of this team. And have we really kind of embraced that our role is really to help people be a kind of a life coach, helping them find more happiness and better quality in their life in a direction that's meaningful to them. And with that, we're listening and looking for forward progress and shouting that out to the team so we're all there to see it and celebrate it and revisit what our role is. Because sometimes we don't look back to say, what did we do to help with that success? Again, if there's a limited scope of services being provided, there's less opportunity to celebrate the fact that Alicia manages her anxiety much better now, and she's back to working part-time, and what role we played with that. So if you're not really trying to tackle all these other life domains with folks, there's less there to celebrate with successes. And then another thing is sometimes with poor team cohesion, that when you have poor team cohesion, the team members themselves, they don't necessarily have a lot of trust with one another. They don't have the level of respect with one another that's needed. And so when it happens, communication just kind of erodes altogether, including sharing successes. One thing that I was reviewing this with colleagues, this talk, and I want to just point out, because I didn't put it into a slide I didn't have it in one of these slides, is the daily team meeting with team cohesion is a place to really kind of like check the vital signs on the team itself. How are staff appearing? Do we appear burned out? Do we appear overextended? How are things going on with personal life stuff that seems to be creeping into professional life? How are we helping them around self-care? So when I showed you earlier how to use time in the daily team meeting, that's where that kind of like team cohesion, set aside time so you all can like just be with each other and check in with each other, as well as using some of it for some clinical supervision as a group too. So I'm sharing you some responses received from a workshop audience that we did on a daily team meeting. So we had a 3-day workshop on daily team meeting, and about 50 ACT staff, everybody was working with an ACT team, reported out challenges they have observed in having an effective daily team meeting. So the below is the scale of the percent that endorsed this as a challenge. So nobody endorsed, we do not consistently host. In this area, they all were having daily team meetings 5 days a week. But we do have about 27% who endorse, do not have cross training, are not having group supervision. Very few, about 8%, said they do not complete assigned staff. One problem is that staff are not completing their assigned contacts and interventions. Oh, sorry, I phrased that as if that was a bad thing. So only 8% said that was an issue. So that's good. People are completing their assigned assignments of what they're supposed to carry out and do that day. We did have almost 20% say that recovery culture is lacking in their daily team meeting. Then we had about 27% that said there's little time for brainstorming ideas within the daily team meeting. And then we have a little over 20% say that their team has cliques and or disruptors. So there's personalities that are sometimes interfering with possibly the function of the daily team meeting. Then we have about 38% who said it often seems like the same few clients get all the attention in the daily team meeting. And then we have about 22% who said client contact reports are not very helpful or sound the same, using jargon like baseline, stable. And then we have 50% who said client contact reports are too long, may involve a lot of storytelling. And then about 42% said staff scheduling has little to no direction. Staff are scheduled for a home visit or a med drop. This is a big one for me. So I think if we can work on anything, this is something to work on. Get clarity around what is it the team is trying to do with somebody and why, given their goals. And then how are we mapping that into the scheduling process and having a clear sense of direction for staff when they're off delivering services today, Monday. And then very few endorse the last two, where the psychiatric care providers either do not attend or do not attend full meetings at least 2 days per week, and then staff attendance not being consistent. Now it's time to do a little Q&A.
Thanks, Lorna. That was great. Thanks for unpacking all of that for us. I assume most of us kind of know at least and do a daily team meeting, but it was really helpful to kind of see all of those pieces broken down. We do have a few questions in the Q&A box. One has to do with time and just really better understanding this idea of, I believe you said, 60 minutes for about 100 clients. And the sense I got from that question is like, how could you do that? How could you do it so quickly like that? I know you and I have, seen a lot of daily team meetings, participated in a lot of daily team meetings, and have seen people do it. But any thoughts that you want to share just based on kind of what you just presented that kind of serve as a foundation to that answer?
Yeah, so I think a few things is that number one, you have to have like expectations around attendance. You're not starting late because you're waiting on two people. So people being prompt and you're going to get started when it's 8:30. You're not waiting for the two stragglers coming in. Also, a big part of it is around pacing. So the roll call can take the most time. And so part of it is if you're a team that is doing very heavy med supports, so a lot of folks are getting daily visits. What ends up happening is if you're serving 100 people and it's Monday, so given that it's Monday, we're reporting out on primarily Friday, but also anybody who got supports over the weekend. Let's just say that for 100 people, I would assume that maybe something around 25 people got a service on Friday or the weekend potentially. So if you have that in mind, even though it's 100 people, you're only doing really a report out on 25 people. So a part of it is knowing how to keep that pace going. So if you call on a name, and another thing I see sometimes teams do, and this is a kind of personal maybe opinion on this, don't talk about what you're going to do. So if I'm calling out a name and I say Francine, if you start talking about like, I ain't seen Francine, but I'm going to see her on Thursday because she's got this court appointment and it's Monday. You don't need to talk about that. If it's on the schedule, it's covered. So you got to learn to cover the things that you need to cover, which is usually the report out on those 25 people. Even with keeping a good pace, you can get practice in sharing really clinically interesting information, but you keep it contained to a minute and a half for that individual. So I think that's the biggest thing is pacing. So knowing that it's just a subset of folks that you're reporting out on and keep the pace moving.
And like you said, whoever's in the meeting. So if people aren't in the meeting on a regular basis, then, and you're trying to spend time, I know you and I have been in some where maybe the psychiatric care provider hasn't been there. And so there's a lot of time spent trying to update that person because they haven't been there for the last couple. And this is the day to update that prescriber. So I think that gets challenging in terms of time then, because it will often go beyond that time.
Definitely.
We had a question about how, on average, how many people do teams see in a given day, assuming anywhere from an hour to 2 hours of travel, depending on where they are. And, I know we talk a lot about this in terms of roles too, like, your role is also going to be somewhat kind of dependent on how long you're spending with them. And the interventions themselves are really going to determine that, right? Like if it's a kind of a longer skills training kind of thing, or maybe you're doing job coaching, that is often going to be a longer time that you're spending with someone. So therefore you have, fewer people that you can see in a given day, if that's kind of those are the types of interventions that you're focusing on, kind of more those psychiatric rehab kind of interventions. I know I've seen somewhere around, average of 5 to 6, 4 to 6 people a day, depending. What are your thoughts on that? I'd be curious to hear what other people think about that too. You can put that into the chat. That's a good place to put it.
Yeah.
About on average, how many people are you guys seeing per day, or how many do you think you should be seeing per day?
Right. So yeah, I think I think the average tends to be like you're saying, with the assumptions in place, and I'm saying you're fully staffed or nearly fully staffed, serving near capacity, that I think when you're scheduled to see 5 to 6 people in a day, you're often in a pretty healthy zone. Because I think that what often happens is that you're going to have somebody on your schedule that is going to be the person who is nonverbal, can tolerate about 10 minutes of your time, as part of engagement. If you press them to be with you longer, it's not, you will have somebody oftentimes that good care is a short visit. But then you have that other balance of having some folks that do need meatier visits. They need more time. And this is something that we see again, you know, if you're being assigned to see too many people, you're already setting yourself up that these are going to be short visits. And there's a lot of rehabilitative supports that need more time. And then we're missing out on providing really growth-oriented work for folks to help with getting a job, wellness activities, learning the skills that help with keeping this apartment, you know, to pass inspection, all those things.
Right. And I think that's why, so, you know, for those of you that are familiar with the fidelity tools, the Dartmouth, the sort of community treatment scale, the DAX, has an average of 4 face-to-face visits per client per week as their average fidelity standard. And per client, remember, not per day. So we kind of changed the time frame here, but an average of 4 per client. And we moved it, we actually decreased that number because we wanted to ensure that teams had more time to focus on delivering those kinds of services you just described, because not more time or more visits is not necessarily better if it's just a brief check-in, right? So we reduced it down to 3, an average of 3 face-to-face visits per client per week in the Team Act. And it looks like we're getting somewhere in that range, somewhere around 4 to 6, 5 to 6 in many people's descriptions here.
4 to 6, yeah.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was saying, 4 to 6. Again, thinking about also those kind of longer ones that, you know, that are more rehab focused.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for sharing those, you guys. Feel free to keep putting those in the chat. We had a question about how does this, how does what you just presented fit with fidelity reviews? Because they got dinged for not talking about all clients in each meeting. And I think that might be a misunderstanding of what they were saying, or it could be a misunderstanding of the reviewers. I don't know, but I think the idea is, you know, that some people are not going to be discussed, but you still say their name, you still call it out just in case somebody did see that person. And then you don't discuss that person. I think also if the fidelity reviewers noticed there were a lot of people that weren't discussed, or there were attempts, kind of like what Lorna was saying about just multiple, you know, try to find that person, try to talk to them, attempt. That is sort of potentially a sign of a bigger issue that can also, you know, affect fidelity. Maybe not necessarily for this particular item, but for other items as well.
Yeah, I suspect what was likely communicated is around, you are expected to call every name out, because you have to create an opportunity for somebody to realize that there is something to share. Because what does ding you on a fidelity scale is if you do something, for instance, where you take turns and you just go around the table and everybody reports out on the people that they saw. And so you have that 75 clients who their name isn't even brought up, to potentially prime the group to say, oh, I totally forgot. His mom called me yesterday and blah, 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 blah. So the idea of calling out names is to serve as a primer to put out there in case something did happen that you otherwise would forget to report out on. So I see, do you recommend morning meetings or afternoon? It should absolutely fit with what makes sense for your team. And we've seen teams try out different times. So for instance, one of our UNC Act teams did move it to the afternoon. I think their daily team meeting is from 2 to 3. And the reason they did that is because they really embraced the second shift idea, which we encourage. So you have a planned second shift, and it worked out better to have that afternoon so that everybody comes together, first shift and second shift, during that time span. And it's kind of like the coming to end for first shift, and second shift is still a little bit mid swing at that point. Sometimes for geographical reasons, it just makes sense for the team to have more morning time of seeing some scheduled folks as you're coming into the daily team meeting before they're going out. The one thing we stress is keep it consistent. Because sometimes we see where the daily team meeting is typically at 8:30 in the morning, but in midweek on Thursday, they shift it to be 2:30 because that's when the psychiatrist can be there. That screws up the whole flow of everything as intended, because if you have a Thursday afternoon meeting, what's the point of coming back Friday morning when you already covered half of the things that you were going to do? So we emphasize the consistency piece.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because I know, many people say the lingo in ACT is the morning meeting, right? They call it the morning meeting. And so we've tried to, even in the Fidelity tool, only call it the daily team meeting because it could be at any time. And interestingly, I remember visiting a team for a Fidelity review and saying, oh, why aren't these people in your daily team meeting? And they said, well, they don't start till 11 o'clock and we have our morning meeting. And so our recommendation was, well, maybe you should start it at 11 o'clock. So, there are lots of different ways to do it. I do think having it in a time that is going to make sense so you can get those visits in. So, 11 might be tricky versus, more of a lunch hour where you can at least have the morning and then report out from the morning and then look ahead for the afternoon. Great questions, you guys. Let's see. So there's a question about, do the teams still have a full quote unquote staffing meeting during the week in addition to the daily team meetings? And I think I'm glad you left this particular figure up, Lorna, because I think this kind of answers that a little bit, that often, teams will have other kinds of meetings that sort of either bump up to the boundary of the daily team meeting. Many teams will have like one meeting a week where it's the longer meeting. And so they'll do the hour that's the regular daily team meeting. And then they'll have like an extra 20 to 30 minutes tacked on for things like, housekeeping, admin, scheduling, those kinds of things. So, but everybody's kind of a little different. So we really think about it as more kind of the function versus the form, because you all kind of, as long as, you need to kind of get these things in, and the way in which you get it in is important. And all the more reason that your daily team meeting isn't super long either, because then all of these other things get short shrift too. Oh, this is
so I see that.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Can you give some suggestions on how to stop long explanations and getting staff back on track to just the facts? So we've heard teams use different techniques, and again, encourage you all to share some of these in the chat. Again, I think part of this is revisiting with the team, kind of like practicing, like, what is it we're sharing? What's the expectations? So some of this is a bit around kind of teaching and modeling that. We've seen teams use funny humor to be able to kind of like correct this. So this may sound really off the wall and silly, but one team had like the rubber chicken. And so if somebody was like starting to go on way too long, somebody very just kind of like quietly would grab the chicken and kind of toss it their way to kind of signal like, hey, we got to move on now. So sometimes teams find ways to do that. Some of it may just be clinical supervision where you're taking them off to side to kind of like speak to like, these are really great, kind of like, there's a reason you want to share all this because it was a really interesting exchange and experience you had. But the problem is it's leading us to have to rush through the last 10 names all the time. So I think sometimes it's about pulling people off on clinical supervision. But I find that when a team has some good cohesion, try to find ways to use humor to kind of do some of this course correcting as best you can too in the meeting.
Did you see the comment in the chat? Somebody said that they use the safe word puppies to kind of curtail the conversations. Somebody will just load up puppies and then they go, oh, I'm sorry, I was long-winded. Love that.
People too.
Somebody rings a bell.
There you go.
Or just say, or they'll say, we can table this for after the meeting. Just, that's pretty straightforward. Great suggestions. And I know, some of these are questions that are actually bigger than the daily team meeting. So we may wind up going into some of our open mics. So if anybody also wants to share something, I think we should just encourage you all, like if you have something to share and you want to kind of share how your team does it, feel free to raise your hand and we can call on you, and we'd love to hear your voice and maybe even see you if you're in a place that you feel comfortable doing that. So we have a question about how do you manage having visitors to the daily team meeting? So for example, the therapist who is not an ACT person or someone from emergency services, how do you handle that? And this may very well be more of an agency by agency thing, because I think, we kind of have a similar thing that comes up around our fidelity reviews, because we are not part of the team, and yet we're observing the daily team meeting as one of our data sources for fidelity reviews. And many of our agencies have different ways of handling that. Feel free, folks, to share kind of how you do handle visitors in your daily team meeting. Lorna, is there anything more? Yeah, go ahead.
No, I mean, I think they're being exposed to PHI. You're the covered health entity, so you have to know internally what steps you're taking when people who are being exposed to PHI, and you don't have do you need a business associate agreement? Can you get away with just having a confidentiality agreement signed? So
those are the two primary ways I know most agencies deal with it, I think, is sending a confidentiality statement or the business associates agreement, which is kind of more at the agency level, typically higher up than, so it's like the admin team at the agency will initiate that. But really good question. I think we need to be careful about that.
So the question about how is volunteer participation determined? Some participants decline but are very symptomatic, then stabilize, continue declining engagement. Do they get close to the team? And there was another question about closing people. Again, ACT typically, this has been the way for 40 years, 50 years now, is if you're serving the people who most need this service, we don't tap out easily. We explore why people may be disengaging and declining. We are declining our services. We are being persistent and creative in trying to offer services that we believe that is going to be most helpful and they want from us. So there's a lot of, that's why it's called assertive engagement and this assertive community treatment. And so usually we're looking at teams having some effort to engage and have success with folks. Sometimes 6 months is what the standard is for teams that they're trying before they start moving towards a termination. But I think that there's a range of things you're also exploring, that sometimes ACT really is too much. They are really doing well in their life. They have a girlfriend, they got this apartment, now they're working part-time and they don't need you coming around as much. They're doing okay. And so that's an indication. So I think looking at ACT transition readiness scales are good at identifying people who may be ready to leave the team, as much as identifying people who probably really do need the team services. There's actually a research study that showed that the scale was better at predicting who clearly needs ACT still, a bit more than who's ready to transition. So I think that's kind of in general. I think there is some persistent, I don't think I showed you, it's good practice that part of your daily team meeting process is you have what's called a watch list or a vulnerability list. You keep high on the dashboard the names of people that are not well engaged and you have concerns about, because when you have it as part of kind of like your structural review, it makes it so that you all are constantly paying attention to, like, when were they last seen? Who do we have releases of information that we can be in contact with, and what are they saying? What are our biggest concerns about them given their history? What have we tried? What haven't we tried? It keeps us really focused on what are our efforts around engagement for people who clearly need this service and they're getting sick, as well as then having that discussion of when maybe they really don't need ACT and they're making an informed decision right now that we should be respecting.
So that was in response to Yasmin and Stephanie, right? Both of them? Okay.
Yes.
Great. Do you want to answer Katie's question about virtual?
Yeah, I was like, Katie, did you notice that I didn't bring it up?
I did. I think inquiring minds want to know.
Well, it's the question of the day for the past year or more about use of virtual platforms. We understand that there is advantages to using virtual platforms for some teams. It saves you on some travel. You're able to maybe get started on your day quicker. safety concerns during COVID and now flu season and RSV and everything else that's traveling around. It helps mitigate those concerns. Our position, I will say, is that as you see for this right here, team building, storytelling, really staying checked in, doing cross trainings, population health. I think there are aspects of the daily team meeting that get sacrificed when you rely only on virtual meetings. We can speak from our own experience around virtual meetings don't necessarily create the space for the consultation, the types of meaningful exchanges that happen. You have new staff that join team that sometimes never meet their actual colleagues because everybody's operating virtual all the time. And it's an onboarding issue where they just aren't coming up to speed with what this model really is. So our stance is that we understand it may get mixed in. I think in the workforce crisis that we're all seeing, that as much as you can enhance people's satisfaction in their job, and if having some virtual meetings is going to help with that, make some smart substitutions, but be mindful that I think full substitutions can sacrifice a lot of key components to doing a really well done daily team meeting.
Great. Katie, did you want to say anything more? You have thoughts. You may not take us up on it. Thank you for asking that question. Feel free to raise your hand, or anybody else who has questions related to that. Okay, yeah, you agree with it. All right, cool. Okay, so actually, there have been a couple of questions related to examples of a scheduler. So I think just some questions about like, what is the schedule? And I think this reflects another previous question that was made too. There's really kind of a couple of different schedules, right? There's the client schedule, or some people call it the weekly client schedule. Some teams do it as a month, but it's a schedule for each person served on the team that is based on the specifics that Lorna specified from the treatment plan. So every person who is sort of on the hook from the team to serve that particular client, it's not only specified in that schedule, it's actually literally to the time. So it's not just the day, it's, John is doing, job coaching 9 to 10 on Tuesdays, and, Margaret is focusing on, she's got an IMR group on Wednesday afternoons. Like those are specifically put into that schedule. And the only time that weekly client schedule or monthly client schedule changes is if the schedule changes, like the timing, for example, or the treatment plan changes. And then each client's schedule then gets populated into a team schedule. And so for all the, what are we at, Monday, all the clients for Monday gets put into the Monday schedule so that you can see which clients are scheduled to meet with which team members and to do what. And so those are kind of two different things. There's like some examples of kind of how those can look. A lot of teams for the team schedule will often use, a mix of like a shared Outlook calendar. Some do it kind of manually and just create a schedule, because remember that schedule doesn't change a lot. The basic schedule doesn't change a lot because it's based on the team, the client's treatment plan. But then you're adding in stuff every day, right? So it's all the kind of, evolving, whether it's, crises that come up, or needing to go to the grocery store, or, needing to add certain contacts to prevent things from happening. Thank you, Lorna. So Lorna's got a couple of examples here, and we're happy to share some of the ones that are also based on some of the teams that we've worked with as well. And if any of you kind of like the way that your schedules look, feel free to send us a de-identified one. We'd be happy to add it to the mix. Do you want to say anything about this one? This is the client schedule, right?
This is the client schedule. And so, yeah, from this perspective, you're looking at kind of client A. This is from one of our UNC teams. So you see some basic information that lives in here, treatment goals live in here, notes that's specific to that person. And then what's happening. So wrap with Jacob on Thursdays. And then they all, sometimes people get alternating weeks. And that's why you have, no, I think there's something about this. I'm trying to think of how it does it. Alternating. Work on sorter, basic needs weekend, plan for basic needs over the weekend. This person, employment support, weekly meds, diabetes education, peer support. So you see the specific things there. The daily team meeting schedule. You can use Outlook. Did you already speak to this? Because I was probably multitasking in my own way. So I've seen teams use Outlook. So you are setting up, each staff is sharing their calendar. A nod to a recent team who was using Outlook. One thing that they did is, so you had color coded all the staff and it would populate in and you'd see what everybody's doing. I think the key to this is just, again, the team Outlook relies on individual staff making their own updates to the schedule. And that's where it can get tricky, because really there should be this centralized scheduling process where the team leader is going in and making the adjustments and changes. But one thing they would do is they would use a generic team schedule where it's things that need to be assigned that haven't yet been assigned that live in the team schedule. And then they get ready to move them in when it's ready to make that assignment to a given staff, such as, so-and-so has a court case and we're going to support them. We just don't know yet who's going to be the one going to support them on that day.
And remember, I think it's really about the function versus the form, and really thinking about kind of what's going to work for your team and is organized in a way that kind of fits for everybody. And at the same time, meets all the functions that we talked about. So that centralization around the scheduling that Lorna said is really key to this. And I know that's hard. I mean, some teams, I think one of the biggest things we hear is, well, I can handle it. I know who I'm supposed to see. I know what to do. Why do I have to, share my schedule with the rest of the team? But again, this is sort of the importance of you being a team-based, model. It does kind of require that ability to really see kind of at the 10,000 foot view, as well as in more detail, kind of who's open, as a manager of a team, for example, to know, okay, this person is, out in the field. So I don't want to disrupt what is already being scheduled versus, this other person over here has some time. Let's see if, they can kind of help go out, to address a need that isn't necessarily in the schedule that day.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure about the question. There's a question about, would it be compliant to have a list of updates and then call out patients we don't have updates for at the end to be sure we don't miss any information? Do you have a sense of that one, Lorna? I think it must be just like if if you didn't know what was happening with that client, then you would just find out at the end. But if
I'm reading this right, I think what they're saying is during roll call, you would make, for an example, each staff would do a report out of the updates they need to share for the people they saw. Then at the end, whoever wasn't reported out on, somebody just starts naming their names to make sure that something wasn't missed. Yeah, I don't have a strong feeling about that for or against it, I guess. I think that the reason why the pace, I think part of it is the roll call is also going with a log. And so it's just cleaner to be able to go through these tabs, which I'm not even showing you. They have a really cool log. And I think we have permission to share. At some point, I'll check with Emily, but she has this set up. So this is the log. So each of these will be 100 people if you're serving 100. So the log has to keep up, your roll call has to keep up with your logging, and it's cleaner to just clip through than to go scattered and then have to just go through these names again. So that would be my one reaction. But this would be the log that they're entering information in, and they have another thing that they're capturing the summary, but they have it built where you're collecting outcome data and tracking that. And then they built it so it funnels into some stats that they can check on, basically. So I think we're working on getting this a little bit more updated, but then eventually can share it out too.
And the last,
Yeah.
oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
So there's a last question in the Q&A, and then we have a little bit of time for any additional questions. So again, please feel free to raise your hand, you guys. You're a little shy today, at least on the verbal outreach, but thank you for all your questions in the Q&A. So question is, what are your thoughts about teams sharing staff members across the agency? For example, nurses, therapists, psych, etc. I think it's challenging. I mean, I think we probably both agree on that, Lorna, especially when you think of some of these roles really do need full-time people. A lot of them do, most of them do. And so if you're really serving, most of your time, about 80% of your time, at least based on the Fidelity tool that, we developed, to really kind of spearhead the implementation of the various interventions that are in your role. So for example, if you're the employment specialist, 80% of your time is really dedicated to providing supported employment services, not necessarily, other kinds of services, case management, kind of generalist kinds of stuff. Although you might be doing some of those things while engaging around work when you do it. And I think that counts toward that 80%. So when you're sharing those roles, I think it's really challenging to then be focused on those specific interventions in a meaningful way. I think it also, this is classic. We run into this with our coordinated specialty care first episode teams, which tend to have fewer staff and fewer full-time staff. And so you get kind of some of these roles that are part-time, and it's a lot. It's hard for them to have all, 50% of their time in one, 50% of their time in the other. They're often missing things like the daily team meetings and other kinds of important ways in which you work that are central to team-based care to coordinate. Other thoughts on that, Lorna?
Yeah, my only thought is I worked on a team full-time and I worked on another team 16 hours a week. And even being 16 hours a week, I felt like I was always trying to catch up with everything that was changing and happening. Yeah, so I just think that it ends up really kind of with the same spirit of, I just heard this phrase from somebody around, it was on the Accolist, or when you have more than 3 priorities, you basically have no priorities.
Oh yeah, I love that.
Spirit of like, you start spreading too thin and you don't use your time as well because you're always trying to catch up with what's been going on when you're not there full time. So
I think too, the thing that happens with the part-time staff is they're less well integrated, which, I already
totally.
said with, you can't be in the daily team meetings as much. So then there are other aspects like cross-training. You just don't have the same amount of time to be able to really fully, share with the rest of the team and educate the rest of the team about what kinds of services you deliver so that they can help to support your work in, while they're providing their services. Again, to kind of really get that sort of more transdisciplinary approach across the team. So you just have less time available, less bandwidth. So, and I know a lot of teams do that because, you're cobbling together, I'm sure. As we know there's a huge behavioral health workforce issue, and folks are leaving community mental health more so than I think they were even before, and that was always a problem. But I think ACT has been hit pretty hard, so we get where the question comes from. I think it's just how can you try to still meet the function of having as many dedicated staff as possible, I think is the goal. Other questions? Any topic? Oh,
any topic, yeah.
Okay, so the comment in question is, I often hear in team, they do not have any case management needs at this time. How does someone respond to this? They do not have any case management needs at this time. So then there are all the other things that we're doing in ACT besides case management, right? We like to joke that there's you know, ACT is often sort of misunderstood as a case management model, but there are lots of other kinds of services that we should be delivering within ACT that are focused on various types of therapies and treatments and psychiatric rehabilitation, including supported employment. And so, you know, case management is only sort of the tip of the iceberg around direct supports. And that's really what we've been trying to focus on more in our training, as well as sort of reinforcing with the Fidelity tool, is that we don't have people served in ACT, you know, for the rest of their lives, partially because we're doing so much for them, but rather that we're teaching people to do for themselves. And yes, there are going to be some people you're serving and you're doing a lot more for, and certainly when you first get them on the team and they're discharging from, say, a state hospital, you may be doing a lot of case management, but over time, the goal is to, you know, try to help them to do more for themselves, which for some of these folks, they've never done before. So it takes time. I don't know if I'm answering the question though. Did you read that differently, Lorna?
No, I read it the same. And I think it's just kind of one of those, like, how do you respond to it? Is to say, oh, so they're satisfied with their social relationships, the quality and number. They're satisfied with their status of being unemployed and not having finished high school. They're satisfied with their housing situation right now, and you don't believe there's any jeopardy or risk to them losing it. They're satisfied with their level of anxiety that, you know, like, I think if you frame it all as like, you're a one-stop treatment team designed to meet nearly everything but dentistry, we joke. And so if somebody needs no supports, you're saying that they're satisfied and fine in all these different life domains. And then they'll turn around and say, oh, is there any family or natural supports you're working with? And you're like, oh, they don't have anyone. Oh, looks like we have something we could be working on with them if they don't have anyone and you feel like they have no needs.
Right.
So
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So then let's work on that, because, you know, we all have friends and people in our lives that help us.
right.
Yeah. So we wouldn't expect
So
anything different.
half the caseload is using substances, 90% to 95% are unemployed. 80% are said to have nobody in their life that you have contact with. I think we just created really big targets that we could be supporting them around. Stage appropriate targets, because you may still be using some motivational interviewing with them around how they see this fitting within their life. Any suggestions for recruitment for staff? Hey, we have to make this job attractive to people. We have to get back to what it was supposed to be, which is this should represent the elite workers in the field who are most skillful, and make sure that compensation reflects that. We know this is just a struggle for everybody with recruitment, but it really is making this job more desirable, because I think the people who have a vested interest in doing this work still exist. They may just tipped it out of it because it's hard work to do when you're not compensated and taken care of. And I know that's an upstream problem that goes bigger than even our agencies. So we know that that's big. Medicaid rates need to be adjusted.
Exactly. Yeah. And I do know, I mean, some agencies are really taking this to heart and offering, I think, in fact, in one of our last meetings, this came up around just teams or agencies offering hiring bonuses and those kinds of things. I mean, we're hearing things like $5,000, $10,000. I mean, I know not every agency can do that, but that's also the competitive landscape that I think we're all working within that makes it really challenging.
I see with Harriet, I think that's key too, is flexible scheduling. So I've seen teams really thoughtfully move towards 5-10-hour days, and you can do it without sacrificing the quality of ACT as long as everybody isn't choosing to take off Friday. That's the thing, is you have to distribute it in a way that makes sense for team coverage. Yeah, retention bonuses, yes. We can't just do recruitment bonuses. We have to do retention bonuses too.
Yeah. Exactly. So we are at the end of our time. You guys kept us busy with questions. This was great. And I did put in an evaluation link. We'd love to hear from you. We've got most of the rest of our year set, but we've got 2 meetings where we're still looking for topics. I think we're going to hold off on the one for August, but we've got an April one. So if you've got any feedback on what you guys want to cover for that, please fill out that evaluation and add that to your comments. And otherwise, we will see you. I got to look at the date. We will see you next on February 6th, 2023. And again, Sarah Kapelovich will be joining us to talk about psychosis reach. Again, if you're wanting to do more around family-based interventions or helping to reconnect a family, so maybe they are not working with their families anymore, or they're estranged, but it's still maybe a good idea. This would be a great one for you to come listen to. So have a wonderful holiday, winter. Oh yes, you had one more thing.
Well, the link wasn't working at first, but I think somebody identified that there was maybe a
Oh, was
colon
there an
missing,
extra
so
thingy on it? Here, let me just put it. We're going to
Just-
send it to you
yeah.
guys too. So, oh yeah, they
Okay.
fixed it. Oh, Melissa, that didn't work either. Huh. Okay. Well, don't fill it out now. We're gonna send it out to you, and you'll be able to fill it out later. And thanks, you guys, for joining us. We really appreciate all
Yes.
of you and the hard work that you're doing out there. We love you. Thank you.
Yes, and have a good holiday month for people celebrating this month too.
Yep. Take care, everyone. Bye.